What if I told you that the most powerful kings and queens in Europe, the rulers who shaped empires and commanded armies, were also the victims of a hidden curse? Not a curse cast by witches or demons, but one they had created for themselves. A genetic trap forged through centuries of marrying their cousins. If you think royalty meant glory and perfection, you're about to discover the opposite. This is the story of kings who couldn't chew queens whose children bled to death from scratches and dynasties that destroyed themselves from within. Hit that subscribe button now, because what follows is the most disturbing truth history tried to bury. For 300 years, Europe's elite families believed that keeping their blood pure would guarantee strength and power. Instead, they crafted a breeding program so destructive that it left behind monarchs who were barely human. Their bodies bent, their blood poisoned, their minds broken. These rulers became living symbols of how power can consume itself when it refuses to share. The Habsburg dynasty of Spain was one of the most notorious examples. Obsessed with controlling succession, they arranged marriages between uncles and nieces, cousins and cousins, until their family tree looked less like a branching oak and more like a tightly knotted rope choking itself. And at the end of this rope was one man, Charles II of Spain, known as El Hechizado, the Bewitched One. Charles II's face told the story of his family's obsession. His jaw jutted so far forward that he could never close his mouth properly. Eating solid food was impossible. Instead, servants had to mash his meals into a pulp and even chew for him before placing it on his plate. Imagine a king of the world's largest empire, unable to do something as basic as eat bread without choking. But the visible deformities were only the beginning. Charles's oversized tongue meant he drooled constantly, soaking his robes and leaving a stench in court. His speech was garbled to the point that foreign ambassadors couldn't understand him without translators. In the grand halls of Madrid, the most powerful throne in Europe often echoed with the incomprehensible mumbling of a monarch trapped inside his own body. Court records describe a ruler whose mind never matured past childhood. He played with toys during council meetings. He laughed at inappropriate moments during serious negotiations. When advisors contradicted him, he threw tantrums like a spoiled child. Foreign diplomats left Spain shocked, reporting back that its king seemed more like a confused boy than the ruler of an empire. Marriage. The very tool that had caused his downfall offered no salvation. Charles wed twice, first to Marie-Louise of Orleans, then to Maria Anna of Neuburg. Both marriages ended without children. Court physicians documented his inability to produce an heir, prescribing bizarre remedies from sacred oils to whispered prayers. When science failed, the Spanish court turned to superstition, even hiring witches to lift what they believed was a curse. As if his body and mind were not already prisons, Charles suffered from constant illness. His immune system was so weak that common colds nearly killed him. He endured seizures that left him foaming at the mouth, collapsing during ceremonies meant to showcase royal power. Behind the glittering walls of palaces, the king lived a life of fragility, his every breath a reminder of the dynasty's self-inflicted doom. When Charles finally died in 1700 at just 38 years old, his autopsy horrified the physicians who examined him. They reported a heart so small it resembled a dried peppercorn, lungs blackened as if eaten away from within, and kidneys already rotting. Even his reproductive organs had withered to a single blackened remnant. The doctors marveled that he had lived at all. His body was less a man than the wreckage of a bloodline. His death did not just mark the end of a sickly king, it shattered Spain's stability, triggering the War of Spanish Succession, a conflict that would redraw Europe's borders for decades. Yet beneath the politics lay a darker truth. The Habsburg obsession with purity had strangled their dynasty to death. Power clutched too tightly had destroyed itself. and Charles was only the beginning of Europe's genetic nightmares. While Spain collapsed under the weight of its own dynasty, another royal family unknowingly carried a different kind of time bomb. Queen Victoria of Britain, remembered fondly as the grandmother of Europe, looked harmless in portraits. But hidden inside her DNA was a mutation that turned her descendants into fragile vessels of blood. This was not just a personal tragedy, it became a continent-wide crisis. The condition was hemophilia, a disorder that prevents blood from clotting. For most people, a small cut means a bandage and a day of inconvenience. For Victoria's descendants, a paper cut could mean slow, unstoppable bleeding. Her sons lived in constant fear of bruises, and her daughters carried the curse silently ready to pass it down like an invisible inheritance of pain. Victoria had 9 children, and she used them as pawns in the great game of royal marriages. What she didn't know was that each marriage was also a genetic weapon. Her daughter Alice carried hemophilia to Germany. Beatrice took it to Spain. Another daughter passed it into the Russian line. Every wedding spread the mutation deeper into Europe's royal houses like a Trojan horse. The courts had no understanding of this hidden danger. Hemophilia was so rare that many physicians had never seen it before. When princes began bleeding uncontrollably from small injuries, doctors resorted to medieval treatments, leeches, bloodletting, and herbal concoctions. Each attempt made things worse, draining already fragile bodies of the very blood they could not afford to lose. Royal families responded with secrecy. Weakness was not an option when your legitimacy rested on divine power. Portraits were carefully staged to conceal bruises. Public appearances were choreographed to avoid any movement that might cause injury. Official documents often blamed fevers or sudden illnesses when young princes died. Behind the walls of palaces, whole generations lived like prisoners of velvet and gold. Prince Leopold. Victoria's own son embodied the terror of the disease. His daily life was filled with restrictions. No horseback riding, no running games. Even walking downstairs required soft padding and watchful attendance. A single stumble could mean internal bleeding days of agony and possibly death. He lived in luxury, yet in reality he was a captive of his own biology. The most insidious part of hemophilia was its ability to skip generations. Because it was carried on the X chromosome, daughters could look perfectly healthy while hiding the mutation. A grandson, however, might suddenly be struck down without warning. Families thought they had escaped the curse only to watch their heirs suffer in silence a generation later. By the early 20th century, hemophilia had spread across the royal houses of Britain, Germany, Russia, and Spain. At the very moment monarchies needed strength to survive rising revolutions and wars, their heirs were weakened by fragile blood. It was as if destiny itself had turned against them, using the very purity they prized as a weapon of destruction. Historians often call Victoria the grandmother of Europe. But in truth, she was also the architect of Europe's bleeding crowns. Through her children, a single mutation became a continental crisis, undermining royal authority and feeding public suspicion. Every fainting prince, every unexplained death added fuel to the fire of anti-monarchist movements. The legacy of hemophilia was more than medical. It was political. Each sickly heir eroded the illusion of divine right. Each cover-up deepened distrust. And soon, this hidden disease would not just haunt palaces, it would help topple entire empires. Because one of Victoria's daughters carried the curse into Russia, where it struck the most tragic royal child of all. In 1904, the Russian Empire rejoiced at the birth of a long-awaited male heir, Alexei Romanov. For Tsar Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra, his arrival was proof that the dynasty would endure. But within months, their joy turned to dread. The boy had inherited the silent curse from Queen Victoria's line. His blood would not clot. A bruise meant agony, a stumble could become a death sentence. Behind the grand facades of palaces, Alexei endured what could only be described as torture sessions disguised as medical emergencies. Internal bleeding swelled his joints until his knees ballooned grotesquely, leaving him unable to walk. His screams echoed through the Alexander Palace while his parents stood helpless, watching their heir writhe in unbearable pain. The Romanovs responded with secrecy. Official photographs were staged to hide bruises. Public appearances were choreographed so carefully that attendants were always within arm's reach. Doctors waited in nearby rooms, armed with makeshift remedies. To the outside world, Alexei appeared frail but presentable. Behind closed doors, he was a prisoner of his own fragile blood. Then came the entrance of a mysterious figure, Grigory Rasputin, a wandering mystic from Siberia, with hypnotic eyes and an unshakable belief in his own powers. To everyone's astonishment, Rasputin seemed to calm Alexei's bleeding episodes. Whether through suggestion, stress relief, or sheer coincidence, his presence brought temporary relief to the suffering boy. For Nicholas and Alexandra, desperate parents clinging to hope, Rasputin was a miracle worker. They allowed him into their inner circle, granting him access to secrets of state and influence over crucial decisions. Soon, a peasant mystic held sway over one of the largest empires in the world, all because he alone seemed able to soothe a child's suffering. But Rasputin's rise poisoned the monarchy. Russian nobles despised him as a vulgar intruder. His scandalous behavior and his whispered boasts of influence made him a lightning rod for anger. To the people, the Romanovs began to look like puppets controlled by a dangerous charlatan. The secrecy around Alexei's condition only worsened the crisis. No one outside the palace understood why Rasputin wielded such power. Conspiracy theories flourished, painting the monarchy as weak, corrupt, and detached from reality. At a time when Russia was losing soldiers by the thousands in World War I, the image of an empire controlled by a holy man was disastrous. By 1917, revolution erupted. Workers and soldiers no longer trusted a dynasty that seemed both cursed and incompetent. Nicholas II abdicated, but it was too late. In the eyes of the revolutionaries, the entire Romanov family had become a symbol of weakness, a bloodline too fragile to rule. In July 1918, the Romanovs were executed in a basement, ending 3 centuries of rule. The tragic irony is that Alexei's condition, which modern medicine could have easily treated with injections of clotting factors, had helped topple an empire. A single genetic flaw had reshaped the destiny of millions. The Romanov catastrophe proved a grim truth. Inbreeding didn't just weaken bodies, it destabilized entire nations. And as Russia descended into chaos, another royal line was revealing that genetics could just as easily twist the mind as it could break the body. The stage was set for Britain's most infamous monarch of madness. King George III of Britain is remembered in history as the Mad King, the monarch who lost the American colonies. But his madness was not just a matter of politics or temperament, it was chemical, born from his very blood. Modern science suggests he suffered from porphyria, a rare genetic disorder that turned his own body into a source of poison. Porphyria attacks were nothing short of a nightmare. Victims endured stabbing pains in the abdomen, muscle weakness so severe they could not lift their arms, and neurological symptoms that warped the mind. George's urine sometimes turned a deep purple or red, a grotesque signal that his blood chemistry was collapsing from within. The timing could not have been worse. His first major episode struck in 1765, just as tensions with the American colonies were heating up. Instead of handling grievances with calm diplomacy, George flew into rages, spoke nonsense for hours, and made erratic decisions that baffled his ministers. The fate of America was being shaped in part by a king in the grip of genetic madness. During one of his most severe attacks in 1788, George became detached from reality. He rambled about talking to dead people, imagined London had been flooded, and even attempted to attack his own son. Court physicians restrained him with straitjackets and subjected him to medieval cures like ice baths and blistering agents treatments that left him weaker but no saner. The British government spiraled into crisis. Parliament debated whether the king should be declared insane and replaced by his son as regent. Foreign spies gleefully reported that Britain was ruled by a madman. Even Napoleon dismissed the nation as less of a threat, sneering at the instability of a country with a broken monarch at its head. Historians now suggest that George's illness may have directly influenced his refusal to compromise with the American colonists. Porphyria often causes extreme stubbornness and paranoia during attacks. When the colonists asked for concessions, they were negotiating with a man whose very brain chemistry was fighting against reason. In a tragic irony, genetic illness helped birth a new nation. As the years passed, the episodes returned with brutal regularity. By 1811, George was blind deaf and completely detached from reality. He spent his final decade trapped in delusions, conversing with imaginary courtiers, reliving events from decades earlier and rambling incoherently. Britain's most powerful empire was ruled in name by a ghost of a man. The Regency Act was invoked, and his son ruled as Prince Regent. Yet the damage to Britain's image lingered. The king, who had once faced down Napoleon and presided over an empire, was now remembered for his madness, a symbol of what happens when dynasties gamble with the fragile balance of genetics. The story of George III reveals a chilling truth. Inbreeding did not only cripple bodies or thin blood, it also destabilized the mind-twisting rulers into unpredictable figures whose decisions changed the world. And as Britain struggled with its mad king, another monarchy in Europe was descending into an even darker spiral of inherited insanity. In Portugal, Queen Maria, I would earn the nickname Maria the Mad. Her reign began with competence and devotion, but soon her mind fractured under the weight of her bloodline. The Portuguese royal family had, like the Habsburgs, intermarried too closely for generations. The result was not grotesque jaws or weak blood, it was a queen whose sanity collapsed before the eyes of her horrified court. At first, Queen Maria of Portugal seemed a capable and devout monarch. She was pious, intelligent, and determined to rule with dignity. But within a few short years, whispers began to circulate through Lisbon's royal court. The queen's prayers grew longer, her anxieties sharper, and her moods darker. What began as deep faith slowly twisted into unrelenting terror. By 1786, her mind was unraveling. Servants reported that she would scream at night, convinced that demons were circling her chambers. She believed that God had condemned her soul to eternal punishment, and she lived in constant dread that angels of death would drag her away. Her shrieks echoed through the palace, turning the royal residence into something resembling a haunted house. Maria's mania soon crippled the state itself. Council meetings descended into chaos as the queen interrupted with frantic prayers or sudden fits of shouting. She sometimes refused to sign documents claiming they were tricks meant to damn her soul. Foreign ambassadors described Portugal's court as a madhouse, led by a monarch who seemed already half dead. This was not just one woman's breakdown. The Portuguese royal family carried generations of mental instability fueled by intermarriage with Spain's already weakened Habsburg line. Maria's son, José, displayed depression and paranoia. Her grandson, Miguel, grew infamous for violent rages and erratic judgment. It was as if the entire bloodline was fraying under the weight of its own inheritance. Events beyond Portugal pushed Maria's fragile mind past the point of no return. When she learned of her nephew Louis XVI's execution during the French Revolution, she was shattered. She became convinced that royalty across Europe was doomed to be hunted down and destroyed. Every piece of news from abroad became another nail in her psychological coffin. Her paranoia deepened until she refused to eat, fearing poison. She prayed until she collapsed from exhaustion. Ministers tried to maintain the illusion of stability, but Portugal drifted into dysfunction. Important treaties went unsigned. Decisions were delayed for weeks. An empire with colonies across the globe was being run by a court in constant chaos. By 1799, Maria was declared mentally unfit to rule. Her son João became Prince Regent, effectively taking the reins of government. Yet the damage was already done. During the Napoleonic Wars, Portugal's inability to act decisively left it weak and vulnerable. The loss of Brazil, its most valuable colony, was partly blamed on the monarchy's collapse into madness. Maria's tragedy revealed something new about the dangers of royal inbreeding. The Habsburgs had left behind grotesque jaws and fragile bodies. The Romanovs bled to death in silence. But the Portuguese story showed that genetics could also corrode the mind itself, leaving rulers too unstable to govern and nations too weak to survive. By the dawn of the 19th century, Europe's royal houses had become a patchwork of broken bodies and unstable minds. And yet, for all their wealth and power, they remained blind to the truth that their obsession with purity had created dynasties doomed to collapse. The lesson would only sink in when it was already too late. It was not wisdom that ended the age of royal inbreeding. It was survival. By the 20th century, with monarchies collapsing around them, Europe's royals quietly abandoned their centuries-old tradition of marrying only within their own ranks. They began to seek partners outside the narrow confines of their bloodlines. But by then, the damage of the past had already reshaped the world. The 20th century marked a turning point. After centuries of decay, royal families began marrying commoners, nobles from distant lands, or simply people outside their immediate bloodlines. These unions brought fresh genetic diversity that slowly diluted the curses of the past. But the scars of inbreeding were carved deep into history, leaving behind a gallery of kings and queens remembered not for triumph but for their suffering. Charles II of Spain became the grotesque symbol of a dynasty strangled by its own pride. His very existence was proof that power can consume itself. The court whispered that he was bewitched, but the true spell was cast by centuries of Habsburg marriages that ignored nature's limits. His life was a living autopsy of his family tree. Queen Victoria, by contrast, seemed to embody stability and domestic virtue. Yet she unknowingly spread a genetic curse across Europe that bled through palaces and reshaped politics. Her hemophilia gene turned royal children into fragile hostages of fate, stripping away the illusion of invincibility that monarchies had worked so hard to maintain. The Romanovs paid the ultimate price. Their secret was never just about a sick boy. It was about how desperation made them vulnerable to manipulation, how one peasant mystic could destabilize an empire by exploiting a genetic weakness. In the end, Alexei's hidden suffering helped light the fuse of revolution, and his family was erased from history in a basement cellar. Mad King George showed another face of the same curse. His madness was not random, but rooted in inherited chemistry. His stubborn refusal to compromise, his erratic behavior, even his disastrous handling of the American colonies may all have been influenced by his blood, a genetic flaw that shaped the destiny of nations. Maria of Portugal's story proved that not all curses were visible. Her mind collapsed under the combined weight of faith trauma and fragile genetics. Her screams through palace corridors symbolized a kingdom slowly losing control. And her family's decline revealed that mental illness could topple empires just as surely as bleeding wounds or deformed jaws. Together, these stories paint a portrait of Europe's royal past that is less about glory and more about decay. The gilded crowns and jeweled thrones hid a reality of weakness, secrecy, and suffering. Monarchies that imagined themselves chosen by God were undone by the simplest laws of biology. Modern science has since uncovered the details. Geneticists now study the DNA of these ancient rulers to understand what went wrong, piecing together how hemophilia spread, how the Habsburg jaw grew more severe, and how rare conditions like porphyria shaped global history. The answers reveal a truth as chilling as any legend. Sometimes the greatest enemy of kings was not the assassin's blade, but their own blood. And yet, in a strange way, these tragedies also humanize the monarchs. Behind the crowns and portraits were people trapped by forces they couldn't control. A boy who never grew into a man. A queen whose children died in her arms. A king lost in hallucinations. Their power could not protect them from their own biology. The age of royal genetic disasters may be over, but their legacy lingers. Every time we look at the fall of Spain, the Russian Revolution, the birth of America, or the decline of Portugal, we see not only politics and wars, but also the invisible hand of inheritance. History was shaped as much by genes as by generals. In the quiet archives of museums, the truth of these dynasties still lingers. Autopsy reports, court letters, and secret medical notes tell stories that official history once tried to bury. They reveal kings who drooled at their councils, princes who lived in padded rooms, and queens whose prayers turned into endless screams. Each record is a fragment of a forgotten nightmare. For centuries, propaganda painted these rulers as chosen by God, destined to lead nations. Yet behind the curtain, their bodies were failing, their bloodlines collapsing. The myth of divine right masked a brutal reality that crowns were sometimes carried by those too sick or too broken to rule themselves, let alone empires. What makes this history so unsettling is not just the suffering of individuals, but the way entire nations were dragged down by their frailty. Battles were lost, colonies slipped away, and revolutions erupted, all accelerated by rulers, weakened by the very traditions meant to secure power. The cost of purity was collapse. Charles II's twisted jaw was not just a medical oddity. It was a symbol of a dynasty suffocating under its own weight. Victoria's bleeding heirs were not just family tragedies, they were cracks in the foundation of Europe's monarchies. Each case was more than biology. It was history itself being rewritten by genetics. The Romanovs showed how secrecy could be fatal. By hiding Alexei's condition, they created the perfect breeding ground for rumors and unrest. In their silence, a mystic seized power, and an empire dissolved in fire. Sometimes, what a dynasty refuses to admit can destroy it faster than any enemy army. The British crown, meanwhile, bore the stain of a king whose madness echoed in every decision he made. George III's porphyria was more than a family curse. It was a force that helped shape the birth of the United States. In the stubborn mind of a sick man, history found the cracks it needed to change course. And in Portugal, Maria's descent into religious terror showed how fragile the mind could become when pressed by trauma and unstable inheritance. Her cries were not just the cries of one woman, they were the cries of a kingdom losing its grip on reality, drifting toward decline while the world moved on. By the 20th century, Europe's monarchs had little choice but to change. Marriages to outsiders became common, bringing new strength to bloodlines that had nearly destroyed themselves. But while the genetics improved, the political power of monarchies faded. It was as if history itself had judged them unworthy to rule any longer. Today, when we see modern royals smiling in photographs or walking casually among the public, it is easy to forget how fragile their ancestors were. Yet their present stability was bought at the cost of centuries of pain. Behind every crown lies a warning: power cannot escape nature's laws. So when we look back at Europe's history of royal inbreeding, we are not just gawking at medical curiosities. We are seeing how ambition, secrecy, and pride turned kings into prisoners of their own blood. And if you want to dive deeper into the darkest corners of history, stories that reveal not only what happened, but why it mattered, hit subscribe now, because this was only one chapter in the endless book of humanity's forgotten nightmares.